This is a webinar for Together members in relation to the state budget, which was released on Tuesday, and a recording of this webinar will be available in a couple of days' time for anybody who's been unable to register for this morning's session. My name's Alex Scott. I'm the branch secretary of Together, and I'll be presenting today. We have had a number of members indicate questions beforehand, so we will try and cover those questions during the presentation. If there are any questions that are unresolved at the end of the presentation, we'll get back to those people individually. And we will also be trying to limit today to half an hour to give people the opportunity to dial in, but not have it drag on too long. And the feedback from previous webinars has been half an hour is the preferred time. So before we start, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that we're meeting today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. In terms of the presentation, clearly we've had the Queensland State Budget was handed down on Tuesday, and there are a number of questions coming out of the budget, particularly in relation to the management of the public sector and what it means for public service positions, particularly in the non-frontline area. So in terms of today's presentation, what we broadly want to cover are changes to the budget principles announced by the state government. Also, discussion about the introduction of the pool, which is a new piece of terminology that was announced earlier this week. And also look at what this means in relation to the statements in the media, as well as what's actually in the budget papers around the continuation of a recruitment freeze, and talk about where to next for public servants and Together members in response to this process. So what we will try today is to cover what is actually in the budget and try and address what was kind of in the media commentary and try and separate out the facts from the spin. In terms of today's presentation, some of the screens are a bit detailed in their wording, but they're designed to be distributed after the meeting to people and are direct quotes from the budget papers. So in terms of the budget itself, this was a significant reform announced in the budget in relation to the underlying budget principles which frame the budget. And so from Together's point of view, what we've been campaigning about for a number of years has been the issues that have been caused by the previous budget principle that was kind of adopted in 2016, 2017, which was budget principle 6. Which was that and this is the kind of exact wording from the previous budget papers, which was limiting the growth of the FTEs being the full-time equivalents within the public sector to population growth. So that had been a budget principle that had been around for 5 or 6 years now and was causing significant problems. And in particular for our public service members, and I apologise, the colours on this screen aren't perfect, but in particular what this meant was that because of the increasing need for services in the health and education sector, we were seeing significant growth in the health and education sector beyond population. And that particularly was meaning that in terms of the dotted lines, that was looking at the growth of staffing levels, and the hard lines were in relation to the growth of population. And so health and education was historically growing faster than the population. Education was projected to drop back below population growth. But the real challenge for the majority of government departments, but not the majority of public sector employees, was in relation to the third bit. And that was because the population, the health growth was employee numbers were growing faster than the population, there was actually a projected shrinking in the public service because of the public sector, and the health HHS is growing much faster. So the real concern about the impact of the budget principle 6 was that because of the focus of FTEs as opposed to expenditure, was meaning that there was a projected shrinking and stalling and shrinking of the public service. And those were figures that were pre-COVID. And this has been an ongoing problem that had been there for a number of years. And so in this year's budget, while we certainly think there has been a significant announcement made by the budget principle 6 no longer exists, and the revised budget principle 2 takes a focus back towards the growth of expenditure rather than growth of FTE. So that is a significant reform. It doesn't achieve everything that we need in terms of the challenges for members in the public service and the public sector, but setting a budget parameter now, we have seen a significant improvement and a significant reform announced by the government in relation to that. But beyond that, the other major issue that has really been affecting members in the public service in particular was during COVID. We have Budget Principle 6 and what that meant. But then during COVID, there was a series of announcements made in relation to the savings and debt plan that were talking about a freeze on employment and recruitment, and also a cap in relation to FTEs. And what that has then been extended to is the announcement in the budget on Tuesday, which is in relation to the pool. It's got a capital P for some reason, so we're going to use that in our presentation today, but all the budget papers refer to that. And I apologise for this screen, but this is direct text from the budget papers. And what it said in the budget papers was that there would be a pool of unallocated FTEs. So in the lead up to the state budget for the current financial year, the 2021 year, what the government sought to do was go back to agencies and determine that there was a number of positions, FTEs within their cap that hadn't been used, and they would be taken off the agencies and brought into a centralised pool. And so this is the kind of proposal that has been now announced by government, which is the pool. And that in terms of these, there is going to be, there was 250 positions taken off agencies in terms of their FTE cap, and then they were about 210 of them were reallocated as part of this process before the budget was finalised, and then beyond that, there was a further 40 positions that were from the 250 that hadn't been reallocated out. So in terms of that, what that means in terms of the budget papers, and this is once again, this is the fine print of the previous screen, is that in terms of the budget, there is an FTE number of 40 that is unallocated. So this is what the pool is that each year the staffing cap has been established, and that is for the purposes of what the government departments can do is in the budget service delivery statements, there is an FTE number. That FTE number is their cap, FTE cap for the year. In terms of future projections, those FTEs can grow for the non-frontline areas in line with either election commitments or other announcements. So in terms of police and health, those FTEs are increasing as well as in corrections. But for the non-frontline areas that haven't been approved for additional FTEs, those are capped on those levels. If government departments now want to employ more people beyond their FTE number, not the budget, but the FTE number, there is now a pool of 40 positions that have been established as part of this year's budget for the 1920 year. As part of the finalisation for next year, there's a number of 40 positions that are going into this pool that agencies will now be able to move on in terms of that process. So in terms of that, the numbers for 21, 22 are the kind of the right-hand column, the budget figure. So for agriculture and fisheries, that's a figure of 2,108. So that's their cap for this year. But if there was significant increase required as a result of budgetary changing government policies and priorities, there is a line at the bottom there that talks about 40, and the government would be, the department would then be able to seek to bid for that. So we had a meeting with the Public Service Commission this morning in relation to this, and this slide is part of the material we've been provided by the Public Service Commission subsequent to the budget. But that is that the cap remains in terms of the process, and so therefore agencies are required to work within the designated FTE cap, but also within that, if they want to go beyond the cap, there is now a list of a number of 40 positions where the Cabinet Budget Review Committee, which is the kind of smaller group of ministers who run the budget, are able to approve the FTE increase beyond their original number. So that's really what the pool is about. It's not a redeployment pool. It's not a pool for existing employees or actually has real people in it. The pool as it exists at the moment is 40 positions which were taken off of the 250 positions that agencies voluntarily, to what extent anything voluntarily happens, but to what extent agencies gave up 250 of their cap that they weren't using. They didn't give up money, they just gave up FTE numbers. Of those 250, 210 were then reallocated back out to agencies, and they hadn't dealt with 40. And that 40 is now available during this financial year for agencies to seek access to employ beyond their current cap and in areas which are not subject to the kind of a pre-approved growth for frontline positions. Whether the pool continues to increase will only occur at this time if agencies then go back to the government, or the government says to agencies, are there unfilled positions that you can give up? And those unfilled positions then can be given across in relation to that process, in that process. In terms of the previous headings, those headings, in terms of this, we just got a couple of questions I should quickly deal with. In terms of this is the graph that talked about the budget for last year compared to the budget this year. They got some of the MOG stuff wrong. So there is a significant change, particularly in relation to cheddar and in relation to energy and public works, which is driven by a readjustment of the MOG numbers between December and June this year. So in terms of those numbers, there are some which are going down by 1 or 2, and we are going to talk about that later. But in terms of the big change in cheddar, that is primarily driven by readjustments of post-MOG negotiations. So getting back to where we're at with the pool really is in relation to looking at the ability to move numbers between agencies where they haven't chosen to employ up to their maxed number in terms of the FTE cap. And the FTE cap for your agency is the FTE number in the service delivery statements and the budget papers. In addition to the cap, the government has also announced that they are continuing with their recruitment freeze. So in terms of that's the way it was drafted for the Courier Mail. And what that is a continuation of what was happening in the savings and debt plan. In terms of that, there's a staffing cap which applies to non-frontline positions, and that staffing cap is listed against the budget numbers. But if there was a recruitment freeze completely, that would result in natural attrition, because as people left, they wouldn't be replaced, and the total number of employees would decrease. So the question is about, does the recruitment freeze actually mean a natural attrition? And in terms of that process, most agencies are stabilising their numbers, but in terms of moving beyond that, those processes move forward. So in terms of that, what that looks like is from the government, from conversations with the Public Service Commission this morning, and looking at what the budget papers say rather than what the Courier Mail says, is that there is an oversight process in relation to recruitment. Frontline positions can continue to be recruited externally, so teachers, child safety officers, correctional officers continue to be recruited externally. For non-frontline positions, there continues to be oversight in relation to whether they're recruited internally to government or whether they're recruited externally. So the statement about the recruitment freeze for the Courier Mail, as applied in terms of what actually exists within government, is a continuation of a practice that existed in April, which was that there is a potential for natural attrition, therefore non-filling of vacancies at the SES level. Below the SES, the position in terms of the savings debt plan as per the budget papers was that there would be a focus on recruitment from within rather than recruitment externally, and that agencies have the ability to recruit up to their FTE cap, but if they want to recruit externally within their FTE cap, they have to get approval from the Public Service Board, and through that process, clearly at the base level in particular, and what that means is confusing in terms of whether that's AO2 in an industrial sense or whether entry level for some agencies is above AO2, that still needs to be done. So it's about managing, the pool goes back to the question of what is the recruitment process for the public sector. So for frontline positions, they will continue to be externally advertised and internally filled. For non-frontline positions, the question comes into this process, and these are quotes we got back in writing from the Public Service Commission today. And this is a continuation of the measures that existed prior to the budget being announced. And they are that the non-frontline positions can be recruited to, but if agencies want to recruit to non-frontline positions by external advertising rather than internal advertising within the sector, they've got to get approval from the Public Service Board and in terms of those processes. So from our point of view, whether the recruitment freeze and the focus on internal versus external recruitment becomes natural attrition really falls onto the issue of if you have an AO8 position that is internally filled by an AO6 and then the 6 is then filled by a 4, is the 4 then external advertised? Because if you don't have some level of external filling of the jobs lower down, the filling of jobs at the higher level is a de facto natural attrition process. So in terms of that, the question about recruitment freeze really focuses on there is going to be challenges in relation to when there is a need for external vacancies to be external advertising because of skills and requirements. Clearly that doesn't apply in terms of the additional child safety officers or correctional officers, but in terms of the ability to work out whether the supervision and approval process for recruitment selection flows into a natural attrition process really will depend on whether there is continued employment of new staff at the lower levels, even though promotional positions are internally filled. And that really then becomes a question about balancing one level internal advertising is good for public servants in that it reduces the competition for promotional positions. But if it increases workload because lower level positions then remain unfilled, becomes the issue about natural attrition. This should have no impact at all in terms of temporary conversions. So in terms of the ability both for higher duties and temporary conversions, this doesn't deal with the issue, and those are covered by industrial instruments and by directives and by legislation, and so there should be no impact in relation to temporary conversions or high duty conversions. We are still working on that. That's covered by future Zooms we'll be doing for members, and particularly the next public service Zoom in early July. We'll talk more about where we're at with the high duties and temporary conversion process, but at this point in time, that process should be continuing irrespective of any announcements made by the government today. So where are we going in terms of this process? Well, we've clearly the question for the union is going to be about whether or not we're talking about a smoke and mirrors process to produce natural attrition for the non-front line, or are we talking about a process whereby the front line is where the non-front line is maintained, but how they are filled is the issue. So in the lead up to the state election last year, the Treasurer, Cameron Dick, was very clear in terms of his opposition to natural attrition being done by the LNP. So he made a number of comments about why natural attrition was bad, and these are quotes from him in his attack on the LNP's costings, where he very much clearly said that the ALP if policy wasn't for natural attrition. Secondly, in relation to that, they together saw commitments from the ALP in the lead up to the state election, and some of those commitments were specifically focusing on the issue of the non-front line, given that the ALP had committed to increasing the front line in the state election. Our focus was trying to make sure that we could get commitments off them to say there wouldn't be a natural attrition process introduced. So they they reinforced their view that there would potentially be natural attrition for the SES, but for the non-SES, non-frontline, there would be a commitment that those staffing levels would be maintained. So what we've seen in the last 12 months, particularly prior to the state election, was that the frontline was reducing, the non-frontline, sorry, was reducing, that the savings and debt recruitment process was reducing the overall, the numbers, and I think we saw about 300 or 400 numbers lost through the Murray data to show that there had been a reduction in the non-frontline as part of the savings debt plan, which morphed during last year when there was the recruitment freeze and then a series of CBRC decisions around that. So we need to be vigilant moving forward to make sure that the current process doesn't result in savings. The savings debt process doesn't result in that process. So the structures as proposed by government are that if we will be seeking, and we have sought from the Treasurer, commitments in relation to the fact that the commitments from the ALP in the lead up to the election are transparent and maintained. And secondly, in relation to the fact that both his comments and the ALP's comments remain government policy, that they are not seeking to reduce the front line. Beyond that, though, that is the process, and they are giving us words that can be interpreted or misinterpreted, but the reality is going to be about what happens to the actual implementation. And what we know also is that there's $3 billion worth of savings over 4 years, which is going to be $750 million in savings on a year-by-year basis. And we wrote to the government saying that that $750 million isn't able to be interpreted in a way that is likely to put pressure on agencies not to fill vacancies, not because of the staffing cap, but because of the $750 million savings that is being applied across the agencies. So what we'll be seeking to do is to get engagement with the agencies and to engage around how they're implementing savings and debt. We have regular meetings with the Director Generals about that, as well as the agency consultant committees. And secondly, to deal with the issue about whether vacancies are being filled and to pull on the fudge that is occurring where agencies aren't filling jobs, and they're saying it's because of the staffing cap. There is an ability to fill frontline jobs. They should be being filled. There is an ability to fill non-frontline jobs. They should be being filled at the very minimum through internal advertising within the public sector. If jobs aren't being filled, it's not because of the staffing cap. Only new jobs which are created in addition to new structures are caught by the staffing cap. Agencies will be managing their establishment, but the question will be making sure that the savings and debt $750 million isn't used as an excuse, isn't achieved by non-filling a vacancy. So that's really where we're going to be at, which means the agencies need to be engaged with and ensured that departments don't lie to their staff and say, we can't fill this job because savings and debt. They can fill the jobs. If they want to fill them externally, they've got to go to the Public Service Board. And then if the Public Service Board says no, that's when we can have that argument about why those jobs aren't being filled. And so we are seeking consultation about the pool and consultation about the recruitment and selection processes. So in terms of the staffing caps, that's particularly an issue in relation to those staffing caps aren't transparent in terms of the budget papers about frontline and non-frontline. In each agency, there is a definition that has been approved. The agencies asked for approval about what that looks like. And so if you want to get an understanding about what that definition looks like, if you contact the Together organiser about the petition, the job titles you're interested in, we can then put that to the employer. In terms of those numbers, the DESBIT numbers do include TAFE, so that DESBIT figures in terms of FTE do include TAFE. They haven't previously been reported in that way. And then in terms of we also then need to be articulate in terms of whether SES positions aren't being filled and whether they've been filled in terms of natural attrition. So there will be some potential that 1 or 2 jobs will be going as a result of potential resignations, and particularly non-filling of where contracts for the SES are being conducted. We have had some questions about the SES pay rises, but the SES and SOs will now be getting a pay rise, and we'll deal with that at the next public service Zoom. But we did get finally got an outcome for both for the SES and SOs who haven't had a pay rise for a couple of years. So in terms of that, we do need to remain vigilant in this process. What the government has announced is a significant reform in relation to the budget principle. The pool should have limited impact in terms of the 40, but I think the risk for the pool in the movement forward is the government tries that agencies, because of budget pressure rather than FTE cap, decide not to fill jobs if they try and make their 750 million saving. That would be a breach of the election commitments, and we are pursuing with the Treasurer and with government a guarantee around the fact that the staffing levels should be being maintained, and then making sure that if they're not being maintained, we deal with that at the agency level. If there then is an attempt to make the pool bigger by going back to agencies and saying you've got to hand over extra jobs, we've got to make sure why those jobs haven't been filled in that process. So that is really where that's going to happen. If we haven't got outcomes around that over the next couple of weeks, we'll be having to look at our options in relation to the Industrial Commission and seeking guarantees around what that looks like through the PSC in terms of consultation about the pool and also consultation about the ongoing recruitment and selection processes at the agency level. But the key thing is that don't assume you're being told the truth. If there are jobs in your area that are not being filled, there will be potential that there are extra hoops to jump through in terms of getting approval to actually approve it. But the likelihood in most of these cases is the Director Generals or the departments aren't asking for approval. And they're probably not asking for approval because they want to save the money by running a vacancy rate within their agency to save their component of the 750 million. It's not because the Public Service Board has knocked them back, but it's an easy and convenient excuse for them to say that they aren't being filled because of the FTE cap. That shouldn't be the case in these positions unless they're the SES, but we can only confront that and take that issue up if you tell us what's going on. So make sure, if you're aware of that happening, contact your delegates, contact the Together office, and we will raise it with local management through the Agency Consultative Committee and through with your Director General. If the reality is that the Public Service Commission, the Public Service Board are stopping it, we will raise it with them centrally. But all the reasons so far that we've been trying to drive this to ground has been departments are choosing not to fill, as I've been told departments aren't able to fill. Doesn't mean the government's not going to change their policy, doesn't mean the government is lying to us on some of these processes, but at this point in time, the announcements this week are an improvement on the budget principles, a pool that should have no significant impact to people in the short term. But what it means, we need to remain vigilant around what the staffing process looks like for non-frontline positions to make sure that we are continuing to enforce the commitments we got before October's election, that this doesn't result in a staffing reduction and that doesn't result in de facto natural attrition because the process is so long, confusing and covered in the fog of process that we are seeing job losses by default. We know there won't be major job losses through redundancies, but there's still, we need to remain vigilant to make sure there isn't natural attrition. But in terms of that, my assessment at this point in time is the greatest risk to natural attrition and job losses is at the agency level and not the public service wide level. We'll keep you informed on that. We'll keep you advised on the monthly Zooms. But in terms of that, that's really where we've got to today. It is more of the same at one level. The pool is a process that shouldn't affect you, but the ability to make sure that workloads don't increase as a result of non-filling of jobs will come down to whether or not we're vigilant about forcing agencies to fill the vacancies as quickly as possible, rather than blaming the staffing cap or other reasons for that process. So as part of that process, please stay involved, please stay informed, but also don't assume just because the department has told you something that's been passed on to the union office. We really need to get that feedback, and we'll try and provide through the monthly webinars to the public service on the first Wednesday of every month the opportunity for us to provide as much accurate information as possible moving forward. So thanks everybody for coming in this afternoon. sorry about the short notice, but given the level of confusion as a result of the courier mail and some of the announcements around the pool, we felt we needed to get this information out as quickly as possible, and we'll now try and get this webinar posted on the web for those people who couldn't dial in today. But thanks everybody for your time. I tried to slow down a bit in my presentation today based on the feedback last time and have more detail in the PowerPoint, but I'm sorry if I've spoken too fast again. Thank you.